This is slide number 35, and I know it looks very, very scary, but it has a lot of information on it because it essentially is going to cover the rest of this chapter, which are also in the rest of the notes. But this is or it sort of organizes all of that information. So first of all, I've mentioned the organic molecules. There's four of them that you should know. There's carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. This means that they're very large, and they are polymers, or we can call them macromolecules. Macro because there's many individual units that are put together to make up these very large polymers. So the way this chart is organized is the first row is going to contain the highlights of the molecules. Then we have the names that you should know from largest to smallest. So you'll see that the polymers are the next row. These are the various examples of them. These are double units if they exist. So these are disaccharides. And these are the smallest units, which are called monomers. So I'm going to take a few minutes here to kind of break all this down and zoom in and out to show you and highlight it. So we're first you can see again the highlights of each molecule are in the first row. The polymers are the most complex molecules are in the second row. And then at the bottom of the table are the simplest molecules, also called building blocks. And so you need to first know the highlights of each of these molecules. So carbohydrates are hydrated carbons, which means hydrogen's added to them. And they're usually the first fuel used in the body. Carbohydrates can be signaling molecules on membranes, which you'll learn about in chapter 3. So you could have a sugar group extending into the extracellular fluid. An example of this would be like a white blood cell. It has an antenna, which is a sugar group attracting certain bacteria. Also, sugars are oxidized to ATP, which is a part of what's called cellular respiration. So those are some of the highlights of carbohydrates, and we'll have slides coming up on each of these as well. The next major group, the major polymer, is lipids, and they tend to have a different ratio of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but there's ones which are called saturated fats. And most of you probably know those are not necessarily good for you. They have single covalent bonds, so they are saturated with as many hydrogens as possible. Whereas unsaturated fats have less carbons, therefore, they have double covalent bonds. An example of this would be olive oil. So it's much better for you to cook with olive oil instead of animal fats or Crisco or fatback, something like that. Another type is polyunsaturated. It's called polyunsaturated because it has more than one double bond. These would be things like soybean and safflower oils. Then there's trans fats, which have an addition of hydrogen, but sometimes they're actually worse. There was a trend for a while there where people thought trans fats were really better for you, but they've since proven that's not really the case. The one thing we do know is that cold water fish are very, very healthy for you. They've discovered that natives that live in north of Alaska even that eat lots of salmon have much better rates of heart disease, much lower. So omega-3 fatty acids are in things like salmon, cold water fish, and they decrease the risk of heart disease and lower inflammation. The third macromolecule is the protein. It also has carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, but also nitrogen. So again, the carbohydrates and lipids only have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, but the protein has nitrogen. It's at least 50% of the organic matter in the body because it's for construction materials, vital function in the cell. And when proteins are made, and we'll learn about how they're made in chapter 3, they're first made beginning with the building blocks, which are amino acids. Those amino acids are put together one by one, and they form the primary sequence of a protein. But they're not yet ready to do their job. There's a part within the cell that's going to take that primary sequence and fold it on top of each other. When that happens, it forms an alpha helix or a beta pleated sheet. It's usually folded again on top of that so that when there's multiple alpha helices or beta pleated regions together, it forms a tertiary protein. So most proteins usually are at least tertiary, probably quaternary. Quaternary means there's two or more polypeptide chains combined to form the most complex protein. So, an example of a quaternary protein would be something like hemoglobin. And we'll talk in a little bit about enzymes. They are all proteins. The last group of macromolecules is the nucleic acids. It, like proteins, has carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, but also phosphorus. And it makes up the genes, which are the blueprint of life. So those genes are going to dictate the protein structure. We have DNA and RNA. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. RNA stands for ribonucleic acid. And DNA is only in the nucleus. And again, it provides the instructions for proteins. RNA is what we call a molecular slave. So it's a copy of the DNA. And when it's a copy, we call it mRNA, which stands for messenger RNA. So you want to pause this video, go back to these slowly, and I would recommend printing out just this slide because there's a lot of important information on it. So this next row is going to have the polymers, and then the bottom row has the monomers. So the polymers for carbohydrates are polysaccharides, and the two you should know is glycogen and starch. Glycogen is stored in the liver and muscles. When there's two monomers together, they make disaccharides, and there's sucrose, maltose, and lactose. The diagram below is like a slide that you've previously seen, but it shows dehydration synthesis, which is when water is removed. So it would be going in this direction from right, or I'm sorry, from left to right on your screen. So glucose and fructose combining to make sucrose because this water molecule is removed. The opposite of that is hydrolysis, and water breaks the bond. So in this case, it would be going the reverse. So going from right to left. Sucrose would be broken apart into glucose and fructose. The next important macromolecule is the lipids. And one of the most common would be triglycerides, a neutral fat, and it has one glycerol and three fatty acids, which is why it has the prefix tri. There's also phospholipids, which we'll talk a lot about next chapter, steroids, which are all made from cholesterol. Examples of cholesterol molecules would be things like bile salts, vitamin D, sex hormones like testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, corticosteroids, and other lipid substances are these three vitamins, um, and things like LDL and HDL, the so-called bad cholesterol and good cholesterol. The third group of macromolecules would be the proteins, and the two types of proteins are either fibrous or globular. Fibrous means they're structural, globular means they're functional. So structural ones would be things like collagen or keratin. Globular ones would be functional ones like antibodies, hormones, hemoglobin. And one of the most significant reasons for proteins is enzymes. You should be aware of all five of these functions of enzymes. They speed up the chemical reaction by lowering the activation energy. They bind with a substrate. They're reusable. So they're kind of green, they're energy friendly, and they usually end with ASE. So polypeptides are going to have a lot of amino acids. The last group of macromolecules is nucleic acids, and DNA would be double stranded, and it's a double helix. It has adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. RNA is single stranded, and it contains adenine, uracil, guanine, cytosine, and there's three types of RNA. Another type of nucleic acid is the ATP. And finally, the monomers are on the lowest row. And monosaccharides are single sugars. And the five you should know are glucose, fructose, galactose, ribose, and deoxyribose. For lipids, the monomers are fatty acids and glycerol. For proteins, the monomers or building blocks are different amino acids. And then finally, for nucleic acids, the monomers or building blocks are nucleotides. And those nucleotides contain a base, a sugar, which is either ribose or deoxyribose, and finally a phosphate. And those bases are either adenine, guanine, cytosine, or thymine if it's DNA. But if it's RNA, it does not have thymine. Instead, it has uracil.